the late summer of 2023, Louisiana's humid air clung heavily to the small town of St. Martinville. Tucked away deep in the swamps, St. Martinville seemed lost in time, its secrets hidden by the dense forests and murky waters that surrounded it. The town's narrow streets, lined with weathered houses showing signs of wear under the relentless sun, moved at a slow, drowsy pace where everyone thought they knew each other's business, though few knew the whole truth. Aisha Dupree, 28 years old, had lived in St. Martinville for most of her life. She was an attractive woman with soft features and eyes that held a depth of untold stories. Aisha's life hadn't always been rooted here. She was originally from New Orleans, where she had lived until her early 20s. After her mother's sudden passing in a car accident when Aisha was 21, her life took an unexpected turn. With no siblings and an estranged relationship with her father, Aisha was left adrift, unsure of her next steps. It was then that her aunt, Mrs. Loretta, offered her a place in St. Martinville, a small town far removed from the chaos of the city. Mrs. Loretta, now 50, had always been a formidable presence in the Dupree family. A widow and a woman of strong will, she had raised her daughter Tanisha with firm discipline and unwavering love. Taking Aisha in wasn't just an act of family duty. It was her way of giving Aisha a fresh start, a chance to heal in the quiet of the town. Aisha, grateful for the refuge, moved in with her aunt and cousin, hoping to find some peace after the turmoil of losing her mother. She quickly found work as a teacher at the local elementary school, where the children adored her. However, despite her good looks and sharp mind, Aisha struggled with a deep-seated lack of confidence that she couldn't quite shake. Life in St. Martinville had become a routine. She would wake up, take care of Mrs. Loretta, go to school, and then return to a house that, despite being full of family, often felt lonely. Mrs. Loretta's strength had begun to fade over the past few years as cancer slowly eroded the woman she once was. The once formidable matriarch now depended on her daughter and niece for care. Aisha did her best to support her aunt, but the sight of Mrs. Loretta, reduced from a pillar of strength to a frail, sickly figure, was a constant reminder of life's cruel impermanence. Mrs. Loretta, too, felt the shift. She knew her family wasn't as close as it once had been, and she worried about the growing distance between her daughter Tanisha and Aisha. Tanisha, Aisha's cousin and Mrs. Loretta's only child, was just a year younger than Aisha. At 27, Tanisha was as loving and caring as her mother had raised her to be, but she was painfully oblivious to the storm brewing within her own home. 2 years earlier, she had married Desmond Johnson, a man she believed to be her soulmate. Desmond was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted, but Tanisha didn't see the darker sides of his character. She spent most of her time caring for her ailing mother, pouring her love into a marriage that was slowly unraveling, though she remained blissfully unaware. Desmond Johnson, at 30, was a man who thrived on manipulation. Tall, with a smooth voice and dark eyes that held secrets, Desmond had a way of making people trust him. His criminal past was known in St. Martinville, though people rarely spoke of it openly. Whispers of shady dealings followed him, but Desmond had a knack for making people forget, or at least overlook, the darkness that surrounded him. He was the kind of man who could bend others to his will without them realizing it, and it was this skill that he began to use on Aisha. Aisha had always felt a certain distance between herself and Tanisha, a gap that had widened as they grew older and took different paths. But it wasn't until Desmond entered her life that Aisha began to question everything she thought she knew. Desmond had a way of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. He would drop by the house under the guise of checking on Mrs. Loretta or bringing Tanisha something she had forgotten, but his real reason was to see Aisha. Their conversation started innocently enough, small talk about the town or the weather, but there was always an undercurrent of something more, something unspoken. Aisha knew it was wrong, this growing attraction she felt for her cousin's husband, but she couldn't stop herself. Desmond made her feel alive, something she hadn't felt in a long time. He was everything her life wasn't: dangerous, exciting, unpredictable. And though she tried to push those feelings aside, they kept bubbling to the surface, tempting her with the possibility of something different, something more. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Aisha and Desmond grew. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a hand that stayed too long on her arm, a shared smile that held more meaning than it should. Aisha found herself thinking about him constantly, replaying their conversations in her mind, wondering if he felt the same way. She hated herself for it, for betraying her cousin even in her thoughts, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. What had started as casual visits to check on Mrs. Loretta had subtly evolved into something much more complex. Desmond's charm was impossible to ignore. He had a way of making Aisha feel seen and appreciated in a manner that she hadn't felt in years. It began innocently enough. Brief conversations in the kitchen while Tanisha was out, sharing coffee in the mornings before the day's responsibilities set in. But with each passing day, those small moments began to carry more weight. Meanwhile, Tanisha, ever trusting, remained blissfully unaware of the growing connection between her husband and her cousin. She was consumed with caring for Mrs. Loretta, who was growing weaker by the day. Tanisha took comfort in knowing that Aisha and Desmond were there to help, never suspecting that their bond was deepening in ways that went beyond mere familial duty. She would often express her gratitude to Aisha for being such a devoted niece, and to Desmond for being the attentive husband she had always dreamed of. Tanisha's blindness to what was happening right under her nose only added to Aisha's guilt. Each time Tanisha thanked her, it felt like a dagger twisting in her chest. One evening, after another long day of caring for Mrs. Loretta, Aisha and Desmond found themselves alone in the kitchen. The air was thick with humidity, and the silence between them was charged with unspoken words. Desmond leaned against the counter, his eyes locked on Aisha as she tried to busy herself with the dishes. But she could feel his gaze, could feel the magnetic pull between them intensifying. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, Aisha turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. Desmond stepped closer, his voice low and serious as he spoke. "Aisha, you know I care about you, right? You've been there for me, for Tanisha, for Mrs. Loretta. I don't know what we would have done without you." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She knew where this was headed, and every fiber of her being screamed at her to stop it, to walk away. But she couldn't move, couldn't break the spell that Desmond had cast over her. Before she could respond, Desmond reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. He moved closer still, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You mean more to me than you know, Aisha. I've been trying to fight it, but I can't deny what I feel for you." Aisha felt her resolve shatter. She knew this was wrong, knew she was betraying her cousin, but the intensity of Desmond's words and the warmth of his touch overwhelmed her. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she could give in to the feelings that had been building between them. The weight of her responsibilities, the suffocating routine of her life, it all seemed to fade away in that instant. As Aisha lay in bed that night, the events of the day replayed in her mind. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for Desmond, but the guilt was overwhelming. She had almost crossed a line that she could never come back from, and the thought terrified her. But despite the fear, she couldn't shake the image of Desmond from her mind, couldn't ignore the way her heart raced whenever he was near. The temptation was there, growing stronger with each passing day, and Aisha knew that her life was teetering on the edge of a decision that could change everything. The weekend that would ignite a firestorm within the Dupree family began innocently enough. It was mid-September, the air in St. Martinville carrying a faint hint of the coming fall. Tanisha, eager for a brief escape from the weight of her responsibilities, had planned a weekend trip to visit a close friend in Baton Rouge. She left on a Friday afternoon, her spirits high as she looked forward to the chance to relax and catch up with her friend. She trusted Desmond completely, believing her husband's assurances that he would take care of everything at home, including checking in on her mother, Mrs. Loretta, who had been under Aisha's diligent care. As Tanisha's car disappeared from view, Desmond's mind shifted to the opportunity that now presented itself. He had been patient, waiting for the right moment to act on the growing tension between him and Aisha. Now, with Tanisha away, the stage was set for him to take the next step. He knew Aisha was conflicted, struggling with the feelings she tried so hard to suppress, but he also sensed that her defenses were weakening. The time had come to push those boundaries further to see just how far Aisha would go. That evening, Desmond casually suggested to Aisha that they spend some time together since Tanisha was away. He proposed a simple plan, a quiet dinner followed by a drive around town. It was the kind of thing family might do, but the undercurrent of unspoken tension between them made it clear that this was no ordinary evening. Aisha, despite the nagging voice in her head warning her to stay away, agreed. She told herself that it was just dinner, just a drive, nothing more. But deep down, she knew that the lines between right and wrong had already begun to blur. Dinner took place at a small, cozy cafe in town called Bon Amis. Aisha and Desmond sat by the window, the warm glow of the evening sun casting a soft light over their table. They ordered simple dishes. Desmond chose the shrimp po' boy, while Aisha opted for the gumbo, a dish she had always loved. The atmosphere was relaxed on the surface, but beneath it, an unspoken tension simmered. Desmond was attentive throughout the meal, his eyes never leaving Aisha's, and she found herself growing flustered under his intense gaze. After dinner, Desmond suggested she go for that drive. The night was warm, the sky clear, the full moon casting a soft glow over the quiet streets of St. Martinville. Aisha agreed, hoping that the cool night air might help clear her head, help her regain some sense of control. They drove through the familiar streets, the conversation continuing in the same light, easy manner as before. But as they left the town behind, the roads growing darker and more deserted, the atmosphere inside the car grew more intense. Desmond eventually pulled over at a secluded spot near the bayou, a place where the only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the distant call of night birds. He turned off the engine, and for a moment they sat in silence, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the still waters. Aisha's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing with the possibilities of what could happen next. She knew she should leave, that she should say goodnight and go back home, but the pull of Desmond's presence was too strong. Desmond, sensing her hesitation, reached out and gently took her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down Aisha's spine. He turned to her, his expression serious, but his eyes filled with a desire that mirrored her own. "Aisha," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is complicated, but there's something between us. Something real." Aisha tried to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She knew he was right. The attraction between them had been building for weeks, months even, and now that they were alone, it was impossible to ignore. Desmond leaned in, his hand still holding hers, and before she knew it, his lips were on hers. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if giving her a chance to pull away. But Aisha didn't pull away. Instead, she found herself responding, her own desire overtaking her sense of guilt. What started as a tentative kiss quickly escalated into something far more intense. The passion that had been simmering just below the surface finally erupted, and they found themselves unable to resist the pull any longer. Desmond's hands roamed over Aisha's body, and she responded with equal fervor, the weight of their betrayal momentarily forgotten in the heat of the moment. In the darkness of the car, They crossed a line that they could never uncross, their bodies entwining in a forbidden embrace. When it was over, reality came crashing back down on Aisha with a force that left her breathless. She had just betrayed her cousin in the worst possible way, and the guilt was overwhelming. But alongside that guilt was a sense of satisfaction, a thrill that she couldn't deny. Desmond, sensing her turmoil, tried to comfort her, to reassure her that everything would be all right. But Aisha knew better. They had stepped onto a dangerous path, one that could only lead to more heartache and destruction. In the days that followed, Aisha and Desmond began to meet in secret. Their encounters were brief, stolen moments that were filled with the same dangerous mix of passion and guilt. They knew they were playing with fire, but the excitement of their affair was too intoxicating to resist. They were careful, always choosing their moments wisely, but in a small town like St. Martinville, secrets were hard to keep. Mrs. Loretta, though weakened by her illness, was not blind to the changes in her Aisha's and Desmond's behavior. She had noticed the way Aisha avoided looking at Desmond, the way Desmond seemed to linger in her presence just a little too long. She had tried to talk to Aisha to express her concerns, but Aisha had always waved her off, insisting that everything was fine, that she was just tired from the stress of caring for her. But Mrs. Loretta knew better. She could feel the tension in the air, the unease that had settled over her home like a dark cloud. The discovery happened on a sweltering August afternoon, a day when the heavy Louisiana air felt like it could smother anything beneath it. Tanisha had returned early from work, exhausted and sticky with sweat, hoping to find some relief in the coolness of her home. Desmond had left his phone on the kitchen counter, its screen flashing with an incoming message. Tanisha barely glanced at it, but something in the back of her mind nagged at her, a suspicion she had been suppressing for weeks. The small voice that told her things weren't quite right, that Desmond had been too distant, too secretive lately. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Tanisha picked up his phone. The message was from Aisha, her cousin, and the woman she had trusted most in the world. Tanisha's heart began to pound as she opened the thread, her hands trembling. What she saw turned her blood cold. There it was, a series of messages filled with affection and desire, the kind that no cousin should be exchanging with her husband. The words blurred as tears welled up in her eyes, her worst fears now undeniably confirmed. The betrayal hit her like a blow to the chest, leaving her breathless and dizzy. Desperate and enraged, Tanisha felt her world spinning out of control. She stormed out of the house, her vision clouded by anger and heartbreak, and headed straight for Aisha's home. She didn't care about the neighbors watching, about the gossip that would inevitably follow. She only wanted answers, needed to confront the two people who had torn her life apart. When she arrived, Aisha was in the middle of preparing dinner for Mrs. Loretta, her face pale as she saw the fury etched in Tanisha's features. "What is this?" Tanisha demanded, shoving the phone into Aisha's hands, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. Aisha's eyes widened as she saw the messages, her own guilt reflected back at her in the screen's harsh light. She tried to explain, to find some way to justify what had happened, but the words stuck in her throat. Nothing she could say would make this right. Tanisha was beyond listening. She had trusted Aisha like a sister, and this betrayal was too deep, too painful to comprehend. As the confrontation escalated, Desmond arrived, sensing the storm that had been brewing. His attempt to calm Tanisha only fueled her anger. The air in the room crackled with the intensity of emotions that had been held back for too long. Mrs. Loretta, frail and weakened by her illness, struggled to intervene, but her voice was drowned out by the shouting and accusations. It was as if the entire family was unraveling at the seams, every hidden resentment and unspoken word now spilling out, poisoning the air between them. Tanisha's voice broke as she demanded to know how long the affair had been going on, how the people she loved most could betray her so cruelly. Aisha, overwhelmed by shame, could barely meet her cousin's eyes. Desmond, ever the manipulator, tried to shift the blame, to downplay the seriousness of what had happened, but Tanisha saw through his lies. The trust that had once held them together was shattered beyond repair, the pieces too jagged and sharp to ever be put back together. In the tense days after the confrontation, Tanisha withdrew into herself, barely speaking as the weight of betrayal crushed her. The memories of what she'd discovered haunted her. Desmond and Aisha's secret exchanges, the lies that unraveled her life. Consumed by rage and despair, she felt lost and adrift in her emotions. Needing to escape, Tanisha decided to leave town for a few days without knowing her destination. She packed a bag and drove away from St. Martinville, leaving without a word. Meanwhile, Desmond, seeing her absence, took the opportunity to meet Aisha. Despite her fear and guilt, Aisha couldn't resist him. Desmond suggested they meet in a remote swamp area, a secluded spot they both knew. Aisha agreed, though dread weighed heavily on her. The swamp, a place of secrets, seemed fitting for the ominous meeting. The overcast day matched her mood as she drove there, thoughts of regret and confusion swirling in her mind. How had everything spiraled so out of control? When she arrived, Desmond was already waiting, his unreadable expression unsettling her further. They walked into the swamp, the silence thick with unspoken tension. As they reached a small clearing, Desmond began to talk about their situation and possible ways forward, but his words felt hollow to Aisha. She sensed he was trying to manipulate her, and her anxiety grew. Suddenly, Tanisha appeared from the shadows, her face twisted with anguish and fury. She had followed them, driven by heartbreak. The sight of her cousin and husband together in this secluded place pushed her over the edge. The confrontation was explosive, with Tanisha hurling accusations at them, her pain evident in every word. Desmond tried to calm her, but she was beyond reason. In a fit of desperation, Tanisha stormed to Desmond's car and retrieved the gun he always kept in the glove box. Aisha watched in horror as Tanisha, trembling with rage, pointed the weapon at her, screaming for answers and justice. Desmond and Aisha pleaded with her to calm down, but Tanisha was too far gone. Desmond attempted to approach, hoping to disarm her, but in the chaos, he inadvertently blocked Aisha from Tanisha's view. Tanisha's finger tightened on the trigger, and the gun went off. The sound of gunfire shattered the swamp's silence as Aisha was struck. She staggered, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing. For a moment, everything was still, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Desmond, acting on instinct, wrestled the gun from Tanisha, who stood in shock, trembling. Realizing they had crossed a point of no return, Desmond coldly suggested they cover up the crime. The swamp's dark waters seemed the perfect place to hide the body. Numb and broken, Tanisha followed Desmond as they dragged Aisha's lifeless body to a secluded part of the swamp. They weighed her down with stones and watched as the murky water swallowed her. The finality of their actions settled over them like a suffocating shroud. Tanisha could barely process what she had done, her mind reeling from the enormity of it. After the harrowing events in the swamp, Tanisha and Desmond returned to Mrs. Loretta's home, trying to maintain their composure. They sat down with her, spinning a tale to cover up what had transpired. Desmond explained that he had decided to end things with Aisha, and that during their conversation, Aisha had become upset, storming off into the night. Tanisha, playing the role of the forgiving wife, added that she had chosen to forgive Desmond, but they had no idea where Aisha had gone afterward. Mrs. Loretta, though concerned, listened intently, but a seed of doubt began to grow in her mind. As they departed for their own home, Mrs. Loretta tried to call Aisha repeatedly, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. The absence of her Aisha's voice on the other end of the line only deepened her worry. By the time night fell, and Aisha had still not returned home, Mrs. Loretta's anxiety turned into full-blown panic. This was unlike Aisha. She never stayed out without letting her mother know where she was. Fearing the worst, Mrs. Loretta called the police, reporting her daughter missing and voicing her suspicion that something was seriously wrong. The police responded quickly, understanding the urgency of the situation. Officers arrived at Mrs. Loretta's house to gather details and begin the search for Aisha. Mrs. Loretta insisted that the police question Desmond and Tanisha about the events of that evening. When the police reached out to them, the couple stuck to their story, repeating the same fabricated version they had told Mrs. Loretta. However, Tanisha's recounting of the story was less convincing. Her voice wavered and she stumbled over her words, raising the detective's suspicions. In a private conversation with the police, Mrs. Loretta revealed the recent tension between Aisha and Tanisha, sparked by the affair. She was adamant that Aisha would never disappear without a word, and this conviction led the police to treat the case with even more seriousness. Desmond and Tanisha quickly became the prime suspects in Aisha's disappearance. The police obtained a warrant to search Desmond's home and car. During the search of the vehicle, they found Desmond's gun in the glove compartment. A quick inspection revealed that one bullet was missing from the magazine. The gun was sent for forensic analysis to determine if it had been fired recently, and both Tanisha and Desmond were subjected to gunshot residue tests on their hands and clothing. The results came back incriminating. Traces of gunshot residue were found on Tanisha's hands and clothes. Confronted with the evidence, Tanisha was brought in for further questioning. Initially, she continued to deny any involvement in Aisha's disappearance. However, under pressure, her story began to change. She admitted to taking Desmond's gun from the car and confronting Aisha, but claimed she only fired the weapon into the air to scare her cousin into leaving Desmond alone. She insisted she hadn't killed Aisha, but this confession only deepened the police's suspicions. Investigators then analyzed the cell phone data from Desmond and Tanisha to track their movements on the night Aisha vanished. The location data led them to the remote area of the swamp where the crime had occurred. The police, along with cadaver dogs trained to detect the scent of human remains, searched the swamp thoroughly. After hours of scouring the murky area, the dogs led the officers to a shallow, secluded part of the swamp where Aisha's body had surfaced, weighed down by stones but now partially exposed. With the discovery of Aisha's body, the case against Desmond and Tanisha was solidified. Both were arrested on the spot. The overwhelming evidence and the pressure of impending justice forced them to confess to their crimes.